welcome, guys. I'm so excited to have you at our South by Southwest panel. The name of our panel is Cannabis Utopia, What Regulatory Model is Best? And we should start off by thanking South by Southwest for having us and the millions of viewers that are going to be watching this recording. So welcome, everyone. Overwhelmed by how many of you showed up. Thank you so much. So I'm David Daly, CEO of Grav Labs. We're a cannabis brand that has a focus on bongs and pipes, and we're based in Austin, Texas. To describe it a little bit further, the first states to legalize cannabis have designed regulatory models that have various benefits and drawbacks. These states serve as templates for what's working and what's not. In today's discussion, we aim to identify the features of an ideal cannabis market, one that would satisfy the many stakeholders involved. It's my pleasure to introduce you, the panelists. Joining us from San Francisco is Caitlin O'Neill. Caitlin is Director of Government Affairs at Ease, a cannabis delivery platform and the largest cannabis employer in California. She oversees government relations and legislative campaigns across the company's U.S. markets. Thank you for joining us. From Chicago, Illinois, we have Chris Crane. Chris is the president of Forefront Ventures, a leading investment and operations firm in the cannabis industry. He has dedicated his career to reforming the nation's misguided drug policies, serving as the Associate Director of Normal and Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Finally, joining us from Washington, D.C. is Steve Hawkins. Steve is the Executive Director of the Marijuana Policy Project. MPP is the leading U.S. organization working on changing cannabis laws, creating new markets, and ending cannabis prohibition. He has devoted his career to criminal justice reform, civil rights, and human rights. To kick this off ahead of this, I asked all of our panelists to prepare a 3-minute breakdown of their ideal rules for the next legal cannabis market. What would your state's regulations look like? In alphabetical order, as I introduced you, Caitlin, I would love for you to get us kicked off with that.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Good to be here. I'm happy to kick us off. I feel like this is a good opportunity for me to brag a little bit about California. We have like a good geographical split here, so we can all kind of give our versions of our regulatory utopia. We've learned so much here in California about what works and what doesn't. It's the largest cannabis market in the country, in the world. And so I think, when I think about a regulatory utopia, one thing that California really got right was being comprehensive about legalization from the get-go. They learned a lot from other states that came before them, like Colorado, which was, as you know, one of the first states to legalize, but Colorado left out a lot when they did. So a lot of the industry remained underground. Delivery actually is a good example of that. So what Colorado saw is that after they legalized, delivery was still flourishing in the underground because they didn't legalize delivery along with the rest of the market. And so you could log on in Denver, go to Google and find tons of services, unregulated services, just, from a simple internet search. And so Colorado actually had to come back years afterward in 2019 to legalize and regulate delivery separately. And if there's one thing we know about state governments is that they don't like coming back to the drawing board after the fact. So California saw this and they really chose to be more comprehensive in the beginning. And so, for example, they included delivery from the get-go in their legislation and in the ballot initiative. And so they acknowledged, that first of all, it will exist anyway on the illicit market. We know that from Colorado, like I mentioned. They acknowledge that it's what consumers expect. Ease alone is going to complete our 7 millionth delivery this month. So we know the demand from consumer is there. Cannabis delivery was designated as an essential service during COVID as well. I think also the state of California ensured that with delivery that local government would have more flexibility. So I think most folks on this panel know that local governments have not always been on board with retail storefronts. And so delivery is a discreet way to meet the demand of their constituents without having maybe, a flashing green cross on every corner. So that's an important thing to consider. I think another important element for my ideal regulatory utopia would be how the industry works with labor. So in California, for example, all delivery drivers are required to be W-2 employees. None of this Uber, DoorDash, 1099 worker misclassification issues over here. So if you want to get into the industry in California and you don't know how, you can start off as a driver, and it is actually a major on-ramp into other roles in a meaningful way. And these are good paying jobs with benefits, and in many cases, the workers are unionized. So here at Ease, for example, we're really proud of our collective bargaining agreement with UFCW that we have here in California. So as you can imagine, this looks very different in states that don't regulate the entire industry, where the underground, delivery drivers don't have these same worker protections. So it's really about, bringing as much as we can into the regulated space from the very beginning.
Awesome, Caitlin. That is really great. I took some good notes there. Chris, you're up.
Great. So as I thought about this, I made a sort of a list of sort of bullet points of things that I think would be at this stage worthwhile to include in any new regulatory scheme. I've been through this in a number of markets now, the conversion from medical to adult use, as well as states that have gone directly to adult use. And so these are some principles that I think are general good practices. So starting off on the license side of things, generally a robust number of licenses in general, I think allows for small, medium, and large players to all obtain licenses to gain a foothold in the industry, and for there to be adequate competition to bring down pricing, to be able to compete with the illicit market and provide good consumer choice. So generally, I'm not in favor of artificially limiting the number of licenses out there, or certainly substantially limiting the number of licenses like we have seen in a number of states. That said, I think given the state-by-state nature of this and the the very real challenges of product going out the back door, it's generally good for a state to start with at least a cap on the overall canopy square footage that can be cultivated in the state. Although that should be reviewed at least annually to ensure that market demand is being adequately met, and that ideally will prevent the wholesale market from completely bottoming out, which we've also seen disadvantages smaller operators who then aren't able to compete on economies of scale, something that we've seen in markets like Washington and Oregon in particular. So finding that right balance between there being too much an oversupply, which tends to squeeze out the smaller players, and too restrictive number of licenses, which also tends to squeeze out those smaller players, and finding that happy medium and constantly reevaluating that to make sure that you're getting it right. In terms of the applications, ideally like to see a rolling application process that doesn't have applicants competing against one another for licenses when at all possible, because those tend to be rife for lawsuits and corruption, and we just see challenges every time you see a competitive process. That said, if you do go with a competitive process, or state does go with a competitive process, I would urge them to do what I call a well-qualified lottery, rather than just a straight competitive scoring system for who gets the licenses, meaning that you do have to prove competency, your application does get scored, but there's a bar for qualification that everybody then who qualifies for gets put in a lottery, rather than trying to differentiate between the absolute best winners and those that finish a point or so below them, because I think in reality, that's not a very good way of differentiating who's going to be a good operator or not, and again, leads to lawsuits and challenges and all kinds of other problems down the road. There should be strong provisions favoring licensure and pass to employment for people from communities disproportionately impacted by prohibition, particularly people of color and people with prior cannabis convictions. A portion of tax revenue collected from legal cannabis sales should be designated to be spent on economic development in areas that have been most impacted by cannabis prohibition and the war on drugs. If the state has an existing medical program, they should allow existing medical operators to quote Steve D'Angelo, flip the switch and become adult use operators on a date certain, without any kind of cumbersome new application process or new needed local approvals, and to use their existing medical infrastructure to seed the adult use market, of course, with adequate protections in place to protect patients and ensure that enough product is available to them first before the adult use consumers. A portion of the tax revenue generated from the converted medical operators should then go to a fund that can capitalize the next round of applicants, who ideally should be pulling from this pool of social equity operators. I would like to see specific protections for patients, things like high dose edibles that are only available to medical patients that might not be available to consumers, low to no taxes, and requirements for inventory for patients only, patient specific lines, things that make sure that patients are the top priority for all these dual use dispensaries. And then a couple of last ones real quick, limited local control. To avoid the issue that we've seen specifically in states like Massachusetts and elsewhere in the East Coast that allow towns to artificially reduce the number of overall licenses or hold up businesses by requiring them to pay exorbitant fees through things like host community agreements in order to receive the local approvals necessary for state licensure. And finally, I think all legalization laws should include home grow provisions that allow consumers to cultivate their own cannabis at home if they choose to do so. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Awesome, very comprehensive, and got some noted overlap. Awesome, Steve, your show.
Sure, I want to add to what Caitlin and Chris commented on, and start with perhaps something that we're overlooking, which is the fact that we are talking about state regulation based on a federal system where cannabis is still listed as a controlled one substance on par with heroin. And what does that mean? It means we don't have regular banking. It means that we end up with the inability to deduct for business expenses. It means that we can't do regular point of sale with credit and debit cards, for example. And we're not able to offer the sorts of retirement benefits that normally would come with operating a business. I want to focus on particularly how that impacts equity applicants, people of color seeking to come into the business. Without the capacity to do regular banking, for example, that means that trickles down and means that you're locked out of being able to take advantage of small business loans. You're locked out of the opportunity to participate in incentivized programs for developing business in low-income areas. The normal ways that people of color get into small business in the United States, you get locked out of. And what we're left with, Dave, is the situation that we have now where the operational capital comes from either venture capital or it comes from asset managers. And so we have this baked in structural problem that we should just address up front. Having said that, a few things to think about in terms of what could be ideal. First, and Chris did touch on this, but we have to eliminate bans to employment for people who have past cannabis convictions. That is locking out people needlessly from being able to participate. And of course, it's related to the fact that this is still listed federally as a Schedule I drug. We need more open zoning, as I think Chris also mentioned. We right now have scarce areas to grow, to process, to have retail space. So instead of municipalities having being asked to opt in, why not change it around so that everybody is in and they have to opt out and raise the bar there. We can also, I think, create more opportunities and for micro grows, as Chris alluded to too. The capacity to grow under 5,000 square feet, for example, opens up opportunities for more small grow facilities where it's possible to have more equity applicant participation. Last thing to say about zoning that gets pernicious here is that it requires, with limited spaces for one to place a grow facility or a processing facility, that drives up the real estate there, and again becomes another barrier for people of color to participate. So any number of ways that we lower the barriers for entry for minority applicants, for equity applicants is, I think, critical to having a just system in place.
Awesome. I want to pick up on something that Steve just said, because it's something that is, really near and dear to my heart, which is amnesty. And, as someone who's obviously, worked at the world's foremost amnesty organization, I'd love to dial in on that for a second, because, Caitlin, in California, there have been some municipalities that have worked really hard on expungement of records, et cetera. This is, as new states come online, this is kind of like the greatest injustice, right? To think of people who are sitting in jail for a crime that is now fully legal. I just like for the panel to kind of discuss that amongst yourselves, because I know that each of you have a strong viewpoint on that.
Yeah, I think that the part of social equity certainly has to be expungement, pardons where applicable, and also de-incarceration. Anybody who's still imprisoned or serving probation or parole should be taken off. I see it, Dave, as just part of righting the wrongs visited upon communities in the war on drugs, and how the targeting of law enforcement too often on communities of color in the space. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would add to that. I think it's absolutely critical when we legalize that we keep in mind the people and the communities that have been most disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition and cannabis prohibition enforcement. This enforcement has not been applied equally across neighborhoods, across different groups of people. It has disproportionately impacted people of color, and particularly young men of color. And those folks who bore the brunt of that enforcement should not then be systematically and systemically kept out of opportunities to join the industry. And I think we need to think about this holistically. A lot of times the focus is on how do we make sure that we get licenses in the hands of people who have come from communities that have been most impacted, or people who have convictions in their history. And while I think that is tremendously important and needs to be a piece of legislation and regulations, especially around licensing, that's only one piece of it, right? Because the reality is the vast majority of people in the industry are not business owners, right? And this goes for any industry, right? There's a very small number of people at the top who actually own and operate businesses. There are thousands more that work in these businesses. So while we definitely need to focus on making sure that those folks have a pathway to licensure and to operating, we also need to make sure that for them, that there's a pathway for them to get funded, because you can get somebody a license, but if there's no funding available for it, they're just going to wind up selling it to a wealthier company. And look, that might make that person a good amount of money, but it's not creating generational wealth, right? It's not fixing the system. But we also need to think about pathways to employment for good paying jobs, pathways to not just getting in on the ground level, but also pathways to rise through the ranks of the companies, right, for promotion. And I think all of this needs to be thought about as we're putting together these programs to make sure these communities have opportunities, not only at the very, very top, but really throughout the value chain within the industry.
Yeah, I'll just add, thanks, Steve and Chris, for that. I think, it's not lost on us that we are sitting here right now at South by Southwest, the four of us, talking about legal cannabis in 2021. That is largely, largely we are sitting here today having that conversation because of the sacrifices that the Black and Brown community made as victims of the war on drugs. So I think I'm glad that Chris mentioned the funding piece being such an important element. I would really love to see private companies step up more in this way to begin to undo the decades of harm on the war on drugs. I think there's a real opportunity for the private sector to step in and help in this way that unfortunately, I don't see a whole lot of right now from where I sit. I think what we know is that private partnerships with social equity license holders should have some guardrails around it, right? I think you see a lot of larger companies out there that can engage in some predatory practices when it comes to partnering with social equity license holders, for example. So what I would really like to see are partnerships between these bigger players and the social equity companies that, for example, don't involve taking big percentages of ownership away from the social equity founders. We've heard a lot about that at Ease, that's what the community is looking for, is to not give up pieces of their company when they're trying to achieve, sustainability and growth. And so, here at Ease, for example, when we heard this loud and clear from the community, we launched a program called Momentum that you may have heard about. It's a business accelerator program where each year we choose 10 underrepresented cannabis founders. We had over 250 applicants across the country this year, whether they're people of color, women, LGBT, folks who are formerly incarcerated. And as part of the Momentum Incubator program, they each receive a $50,000 grant, no equity taken. That's the important piece here, no equity taken in their business. And that's followed by a 12-week business mentorship program, at the end of which, they get to attend a pitch day where they can pitch their businesses to investors for continued funding. So, I think the right social equity programs actually help to facilitate sustainable long-term wealth in these communities. And that's what I'd like to see more of.
Awesome, thanks. All of this kind of makes me realize that one of the big pieces of really understanding how to get to the perfect regulatory model is to recognize what has gone really wrong in the past. For example, Texas is really, Texas legislators really like to put a feather in their cap when they talk about decriminalization, for example, which, on this note, obviously we don't want people to go to jail for it. In fact, we think people should be let free after it becomes legalized or, right away. But just a simple decriminalization is almost like a, free pass to the illicit market. So, I just like each of your views on some of the policies that have gone really wrong, kind of a loophole clause, right? Where, we thought this was in good faith, but here's what didn't work out. For example, Caitlin brought up a localized not opting in by municipalities. So please let me know, or I guess, I'd love to discuss that.
Sure, happy to jump in on that one. I'll give you a couple examples. There are lots of them, like lots and lots of examples of what hasn't gone. And the interesting is, by and large, most of these policies that haven't worked out well, they were put in place in good faith, right? And I don't want to disparage the lawmakers or the ballot initiative writers that did them, because they were thinking through. They happened so early on that they didn't have a reference point, right? And so they were just thinking through anticipating problems and putting what they thought was good policy in place, or they were trying to fix something that hadn't gone right in previous laws, and it didn't wind up going right again. So I'll give you three quick examples. I would look at California in general as, I think, something where the folks that wrote the initiative wanted to think about, how do we create an industry that's going to allow for lots of different types of participation. What they wound up with was a licensing structure that's way too complex, way too many kinds of licenses. Micro licenses are great, but there's like 5 different license classes within, cultivation, retail, production each. And I mean, you literally need an attorney to figure out which kinds you can have if you have others. And it's become really challenging for the state to implement. And it's become really difficult, particularly for small business operators, to navigate and to get licensed and to get operational. So like not overthinking it, I think is one good lesson that we can learn from the way California was set up. Right here in my home state of Illinois, current home state of Illinois, I think they set up a terrific framework to make sure that the existing operators got up and running really quickly, right? We flipped the switch in 6 months, started generating lots and lots of tax revenue from the businesses that converted. And the whole idea was we were then going to use that tax revenue to fund the next round of social equity operators, right? The next round of licensing was supposed to go predominantly to social equity licensees. And everything worked really well up until the actual licensing for that next round. And unfortunately, whoever was, the review process did not go well, to the point where it ended up being a very small number of people that qualified for the ultimate lottery. Most of those, it turned out, were connected to well-capitalized larger companies. Not many of them were real social equity applicants. And so now the state's being sued by both, right? The equity applicants that didn't make it are suing because they said they should have been in. The ones that did make it are suing because they're saying, well, you can't let these other ones back in. And it's led to a massive delay in issuing those licenses. So again, a well-qualified lottery probably would have solved that. Instead, they basically went with a lottery that only applied if two companies were tied, which basically meant only the companies that got perfect scores qualified for the lotteries, right? So they set the bar too high. That one little mistake, setting the bar too high for the lottery, has led to, I don't want to say chaos, right, but lots of lawsuits and lots of delays in getting things up and running. The last one I would point out is Massachusetts, which I alluded to earlier, where we did set up a system in Mass. I was one of the authors of that initiative. It's my last home state before I moved here to Illinois. And in that ballot initiative, we said that municipalities can only opt out if they put it to a vote of the people, right? That was ultimately changed by the legislature to say if that municipality had voted against the initiative, that the legislature can do it, otherwise it has to go to a vote. That's all worked just fine. The problem is the regulators put a requirement in place that in order to get a state license, you have to get the town to provide you with a host community agreement. And there is no standard, no defined standard by which a company needs to meet in order to get granted one of those host community agreements. So it's not like you're going for a use permit where you can say, I checked all those boxes, and then if the municipality doesn't grant it to you, you can sue them, you're going to win. In this case, as long as they don't say, we don't want it in our town, they can come up with any excuse they want not to grant the host community agreement. And the result has been an artificial limit on the number of licenses, because lots of towns have used this as a way to either de facto ban or to only pick one horse to ride in that town, when by law, they're supposed to have more than that. And so it's made it much more difficult for folks to get in. And it's particularly disproportionately impacted the social equity applicants, who the state has done a really good job of making sure that they get priority in the application process. But many of these equity licensees don't have prior business experience. They may be a person of color trying to apply in a town that is very, very, very white. They may have a prior conviction, which might make them scary to the powers that be that issue the host community agreements. And so it's been really difficult for social equity licensees in much of Massachusetts to get licensed, despite the fact that the law and the regulations all provide for an avenue for them to get licensed. So, I mean, really, some really good policies, right? Really well intentioned, where in the cases, at least in Illinois and Massachusetts, like one small piece basically derailed all of that potential progress.
What I would add to what Chris said about the host agreements, and perhaps this is even more broader whenever you have municipal players engaged in the space, it opens the door for corruption as well. People have been prosecuted in my home state of Maryland for taking bribes, and it's playing out in some of the municipalities in Massachusetts and elsewhere. What I would add that has been the problem in a state like New York is that there was such a concern, I think, initially that they wouldn't be able to control the cannabis market unless it was a very narrow, very limited number of licenses, and all and they all had to be vertical. So it created a real oligopoly of maybe, it's a very select number of operators in the state, which has totally locked out any smaller operators, equity businesses. And of course, this is what's become so difficult now in moving New York forward towards full legalization.
Yeah, Steve, it's interesting you brought that up. I was just reading some of the proposals on the table for New York State as we, hope, knock on wood, hopefully get towards adult use in New York. And I found it really interesting to see that it is likely that many of those initial medical operators, the few and the rich of them, will also be grandfathered out of many requirements that will come for adult use operators that want to get into the industry at that point in time, such as, caps on licenses they'll be excluded from, the ability to verticalize might not be available to folks besides those existing medical operators. So that's scary as well. But as far as, what I think isn't working, I really think that the best indicator of policy that isn't working in a given jurisdiction is how much of a stronghold the illicit market still has over that particular area. Legalizing cannabis is just the beginning, and the next big challenge is access to cannabis. You can say it's legal all day long, but unless there is access in practice, it simply is broken. And like others have mentioned, local governments have a lot to do with that. We need to see more local governments overturning their bans on commercial cannabis in all of these states. We know that local bans on cannabis do not stop the illicit market. The illicit market is booming. In California, as much as 80% of the cannabis sold here still comes from the illicit market. And you might ask, why do Californians still turn to the illicit market when it's a state where cannabis is legal? Well, we actually polled California cannabis consumers here to ask them. The first reason they choose to continue with the illicit market as consumers is cost. The illicit market does not pay taxes. They don't comply with, testing or other requirements for their products. And so as a result, their products are cheaper and they're more competitive in the marketplace, right? The second reason is convenience. So in many places, folks simply don't have access to legal cannabis retailers, even if they live in a state that has legalized cannabis. So what we see here in my backyard is that half of all Californians live more than an hour away from a legal retailer. That is insanity. Driving long distances like this, especially during COVID, to mention, is not an option. It's not an option for the elderly or for people, suffering with cancer, AIDS, or PTSD. The good news is that delivery can help solve that gap in California, but these jurisdictions, they need access. So at the end of the day, we need to see local governments getting with the program here.
Wow, I had no idea that this panel would take the turn of, the best regulatory model is a model that really has a really strong focus on how to activate and incentivize the smaller municipalities located within. So that's a big takeaway for me so far. I think I want to zoom out for a second as we, kind of near, the final third of the panel to talk about what's going on a federal level. This was a piece that Steve brought up in his 3 minutes of, the perfect cannabis utopia, which is, in order for this to really be a perfect, regulatory model on a state-by-state basis, we have to first open up a lot of the prohibitive actions at the federal level. There's been a lot of movement at the federal level this year. We expect there to be more. Some of the stuff that Steve brought up was banking, 280E, you didn't name it explicitly, but, the tax implications of operating, a business that is squarely, delivering a Schedule I substance, access to credit, employee benefits. So I'd love to hear from the panel on where we think federal is going, what is likely to happen this year. And this is where I really want to zoom out, hear everyone's take on it. And then we'll kind of conclude going back to localized and seeing where it takes us.
I don't mind starting, I guess. I think that what's really on the table federally is going to be descheduling, with Senators Booker, Schumer, and Wyden having announced that they plan to drop a bill that not only will call for descheduling cannabis, but my understanding is that they will proffer a regulatory, tax, jurisdictional infrastructure as well. So ideally coming out of the feds, we will have, in this session, a real concerted effort to see cannabis descheduled, and then hopefully sort of a light federal footprint in terms of regulation, knowing that the state regulatory bodies will continue to really do the work at the state level, and each state will have its own particularities. What that does, though, Dave, is I think it will accelerate the efforts around the country towards state legalization once the federal ban drops. The other, I think, interesting thing not to lose track of federally is that with Gina Raimondo, the former governor of Rhode Island, now headed to Commerce, and her strong views on legalization, I would suspect that we're going to see the Commerce Department talk about the U.S. losing its market share globally more. And that's exciting because, as we know, Mexico, I think it's in April where the Mexico Senate has to vote on legalization. So, the U.S. is getting sandwiched already between Canada and Mexico and what's happening in Europe and South America. So I would suspect that we'll hear our Commerce Department start talking about the U.S. losing out as a global competitor.
Great point.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I can't. I mean, I agree with everything that Stephen just said. I like to say that when the Democrats took those 2 seats in Georgia that flipped the Senate, I think we went from getting safe banking passed, right, and allowing banking access for the industry. I think we went from that being our best case scenario to probably our worst case scenario for the year. And that's a huge deal, right? I mean, banking, I don't want to say it's inevitable by any means, but that's the issue that we had a real chance of getting passed with a Republican-controlled Senate. And so I think that, if they can't figure out a way to get descheduling or much broader reform done, I think at the very least, we're going to get access to banking here in the United States, which opens up, not just access to checking accounts for businesses, but also entire new avenues of investment, right? Traditional loans now become available to small business owners that aren't available now. It's possible, although I don't, as the Safe Banking Act is currently written, I don't think it would happen, but it is possible that would include access to U.S. exchanges for publicly traded companies. Right now, the publicly traded companies in the space all have to be listed on the Canadian Securities Exchange, which is not even the largest exchange in Canada. If these companies could start listing on the NASDAQ or the NYSE, you might see 2 to 4 times a jump in valuations of the publicly traded companies just because of the access to institutional capital that would open up here in the United States. But I am cautiously optimistic that we're going to see broader reform along the likes of which Stephen just mentioned. And I think that's largely a product of how far the Democratic Party leadership has come on this issue in their last few years in the wilderness. And I remember working on this during the Obama administration, the last time the Democrats controlled everything. And while Pelosi and some of the leadership, said some of the right things around this issue, they never really, I don't think they really meant it. They just weren't there yet. But the Democratic Party and leadership in the Democratic Party has come so far, especially just in the last 5 years or so, where they not only do they get the issue, but they really get the nuances of it. And I particularly call out the Congressional Black Caucus for having spent a lot of time understanding the issue, not just supporting legalization or descheduling, but supporting doing it the right way that addresses equity, that provides for opportunities for the communities that we've been talking about. And it seems to be a real policy priority for the Democratic Party. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get it done in a Senate that they control with a 51-50 majority. But it does mean that I think it will be a major priority for leadership. And there's a lot that can get rammed through during reconciliation. I think the question is not, will there be reform this year? I think the question is, what will that look like and how comprehensive will it be?
Kayla, I'm gonna pick on you for a second because the way I hope you answer this question has a lot to do with with being our California representative here, and assuming federal descheduling, will we see states continue to be closed off to each other, or are we going to see interstate commerce? That's a big piece that is going to, that I think regulators, as like Texas and New York, are going to be thinking about as they're designing these regulatory models.
That's such a good question. I think it's something that's on the minds of most states that have regulated already. You look at Oregon, for example, in their past legislative session, they just passed a bill that said, hey, federal government, whenever you say we can go, we have approved within our state interstate commerce. So I think you'll see that trend continue, hopefully this year in California and other states, where states are sort of getting ahead of the issue and saying in their own statutes, we are opting into interstate commerce. We are just waiting on the federal government to act so that we can go ahead and do it. And so I think we will see more state action, but again, in order for it to work, we have to see the federal government act. And so I want to give a lot of props to MPP here on the federal front. They do the best work when it comes to the fight federally. It's not easy work. We've been longtime supporters of MPP over here, lots of fans. And I think just the last thing I'll say about federal in general is that it's about damn time. It's important to note that when you look at the election that we just had in 2020, not only did we have the great news in the Senate rates that will help, but we also saw that cannabis was the winner of the 2020 election in both red and blue states, right? We saw voters approving state ballot measures to either legalize or decriminalize in every state where it was available for voters to vote on. And so what that means is today, 1 in 3 Americans lives in a state where cannabis is legal. And what that means is that as a result, more members of our Congress and of our Senate represent a constituency where cannabis is legal. So, we actually looked into this in a report that we recently published called the State of Cannabis Report. And we saw that in 3 states specifically, Arizona, New Jersey, and Mississippi, cannabis received more votes than either presidential candidate did. So the people have spoken, and I think that the stage is really set for us to move toward federal reform because of that.
Steve, you talked about it for a second, but there's you have these states, some of these states that have oligopolies that are very obviously not going to want cannabis imported into their state. What happens, right? I'm unclear with that. Are they going to be allowed to keep it out? Is it going to be, criminalized? Like how does that unfold as the borders fall?
Yeah, and there's even small business owners, equity applicants who got their business going, who don't want to see it totally get taken over as interstate commerce rolls. Look, I think Congress can set a timeline or a timetable for full interstate commerce. It can be phased in over a number of years. That may be one creative solution. But this goes back to, I guess, what I said at the very beginning, Dave. We've built everything around this artificial structure that we've been operating in. So normally when businesses start in the United States, one does not start with the conversation about interstate commerce. It's just there. And now we're coming back, after we've been building this for the last decade, having to ponder these questions. These to me are the problems I would like to have. So it's a sign that we are maturing, and we're about to go nationally and internationally.
Awesome. Chris, did you have anything that you wanted to add to the interstate commerce question? I know that this, I don't want to let this die because I think that a lot of the viewers are going to want to know what that looks like, and how it affects state regulatory models.
Yeah, so my guess is honestly is that we don't know yet, and I think that this is going to be. I doubt that this is even going to be addressed in the ultimate legislation. I think this is largely going to be dealt with in federal rulemaking, and that's a very lengthy process. Right? So I don't think when we see the federal government pass descheduling, all of a sudden the walls of interstate commerce come crashing down immediately. I mean, if you look at what happened with, say, hemp legalization as part of the Farm Bill, right? That's been a couple of years now. And the FDA is still working through their regulatory process there. So I think once descheduling happens, it's probably anywhere from a 2 to 5 year process for the federal government to put some sort of regulations in place. I could foresee, and this is not necessarily a prediction, but I could foresee a scenario along the lines of what you described, Dave, where states largely have the ability to make the decision as to whether or not they want to participate in interstate commerce and at what level. So I could see a situation, if that's allowed, where, say, Oregon, Washington, California, right, natural producer exporter states, right, they want to export as much as they possibly can across around the country, or even around the world when international commerce opens up. I could see a state like Utah, for example, saying, you know what, we're not really comfortable with the idea of regulating the production of sin in our state. So we don't want anybody growing cannabis in Utah. We're just going to allow it all to be imported from Oregon and Washington or California, and it can be sold in our stores because we have to allow it to happen, but we're not going to oversee all that mess here. And you could see other states, particularly more conservative states in the middle of the country, making similar decisions because they simply don't want to be in the business of regulating cannabis production. And then you could see states like New York, Florida, Illinois, for example, particularly some of these states that have a pretty limited number of licenses that tend to be controlled by some fairly well-connected, well-capitalized players who want to maintain their market position. And those states may say, we're going to maintain the status quo here, right? We're going to stay closed. We're not going to allow any cannabis to go in state or out of state, and we're going to keep this, intra or interstate, I guess you would call it, process alive, where nothing goes in and out. Right, we're just going to do everything within our state and stay closed off. I don't think that that's a viable solution in the long run, and I don't think that it's a sustainable solution in the long run. But I absolutely could see a scenario where that is the solution on an interim basis. And by interim, it could be anywhere from 3 to 10 years, right, before we have a full system in place where courts start ruling, no, you can't limit product going across state lines and something that's federally legal. Right, eventually those walls of interstate and international commerce will likely come down. But I could see a scenario where this is the case for the near term to medium term future.
I wanted to touch on each of you going around but saying something that Texas wants to try to avoid as they hopefully come up with a legalization model in this legislature, which is a bold proposition, but I think it's something that's entirely possible. And then we'll wrap up with each of you having kind of a last word, as they like to do on the MJ Today podcast. So we'll go clockwise here. We're going to go Caitlin, Steve, Chris, go.
All right, Texas. This is a fun one. Wouldn't that be great if we could come to South by Southwest and have legal cannabis next time around? That would be amazing. Texas has such a dark history of criminalizing cannabis that I think when it comes to Texas specifically, I want to go back to our conversation about social equity programs. I mean, a state like Texas cannot simply legalize without baking in social equity programs and expungement programs into their process so that they can begin to undo the harms. And as I've mentioned before, I think that there is a role for the private sector here, particularly in Texas, because Texas is such a pro-business state, right? I think there would be a real opportunity for the private sector to step in and to support social equity in a meaningful way there. But yeah, lot to undo.
I would like to see all that great Texas spirit of industry and independence really unleashed. And what I mean by that is creating as many opportunities as possible for licensing, making it as lowering the barriers of entry, and creating a really robust marketplace where business can really thrive, where there's not as many zoning restrictions as we see elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add to, I mean, I agree with all of those and, things I had said before, particularly around local control, host community agreements, right? Making sure that we don't make it too difficult or cumbersome, or, these policies that lead to unintentional limiting of licensing and making it more difficult for small business owners to get licensed. So I think I've kind of hit on the things that would like them to not do, and I don't know, maybe like put something in there just guaranteeing that Willie Nelson can grow as much weed on his farm in Austin as possible. I think that'd be a good thing to do for someone who's been such a champion for the cause and so associated with Texas. It's not really something not do, but like the little carve out there for Willie. If anyone in the States deserves it, it's probably him.
Take that to the voters. Who can say no to that?
We'll call it the Willie Nelson Legalization Act, right? Make it so nobody can vote against it.
Ricky Williams too. We like Ricky here in Austin too.
Yes, so, yeah, we could throw Ricky in there too.
Anyways,
Matthew McConaughey.
Last word, Caitlin, Steve, Chris, before we go.
I mean, I'll be quick. I just think when it comes to a regulatory utopia, I cannot say enough. Access. Every state needs to be thinking about access when they legalize. It's, when it comes to patients, when it comes to consumers, when it comes to combating the illicit market, for empowering social equity communities. We need to have access that works in practice and not just in concept. So I'll leave you with that.
I'll leave you with the fact that our Republican senators and members of Congress and local legislators have to realize that their own constituents now are supportive of cannabis. Mississippi, South Dakota, and Montana all embraced legalization in this last federal elections. The time for this to be fully seen as a bipartisan issue, which it is with the electorate, needs to now happen with politicians.
Yeah, and I guess the only other thing I would add is just like, don't overcomplicate this. Right, it's not that hard, right? And we have a lot of, there's a lot of examples out there already of what's worked, what hasn't worked. We talked a lot about this here. And I kind of feel like every state, when they approach this, feels like they have to reinvent the wheel for some reason, or they have to put like their own spin on it. And like, they don't really. Like, we kind of know how to do this now. And I think don't make it too complicated. This is one thing I will say, Texas is a Republican state, and while Republican states by and large have fought this more, have at least fought legalization a bit more, once it's there, they've actually been pretty good at implementation, right? There's less sort of Byzantine bureaucracy put in place, right? We've seen like the medical marijuana program in Oklahoma works really, really well. And they didn't overthink it. They made licensing relatively easily available. Arkansas, it's working relatively well, right? They haven't put up a whole lot of roadblocks to business. Way too few licenses in Arkansas, but that was a part of the initiative process. So I have some faith that Texas will get it right, at least on the on the implementation side. But yeah, I mean, my message is don't overthink it. And move to implementation as quickly as possible, because if ultimately you want to eliminate the illicit market, you got to get the program up and running. And if you have a program that takes 5 years to implement, you're not going to solve those problems. Well,
Caitlin O'Neill from EASE, Stephen Hawkins from Marijuana Policy Project, and Chris Crane from Forefront. Thank you so much, guys. And that's a wrap for our South by Southwest panel. I appreciate it, guys.
Thank you.